In the heart of Beirut, one of the Mossad's most daring spies lived in plain sight. From the outside, Shulamit Cohen was the perfect housewife. She doted on her 7 children, cooked elaborate meals, and hosted the Lebanese elite, all without a hair out of place. Behind this domestic facade lay a hard-bitten fearlessness. For over a decade, Shula passed critical intelligence to the Israeli authorities and smuggled countless Jewish refugees to safety, using her cover as a housewife to evade suspicion. She had plenty of close calls, but always managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities until they caught one of her smugglers. Broken by harsh interrogation, he confessed everything, and Shula found herself dragged from her picture-perfect life into a nightmare. Abused and imprisoned for years, she refused to break. So, how did a young mother with no formal training become one of Israel's most daring spies? Today, Shulamit Cohen is an Israeli legend, which means that every story about her is slightly different. That's the nature of legends. The structure of the narrative is always the same, but the details blur and change with each retelling, depending on who is speaking. Even her children don't quite agree on the specifics. This retelling came from the only source that actually describes Shula's inner life, her biography, codenamed Pearl, which opens with Shula's teenage years. Shulamit Cohen had no interest in getting married. She was only 16, more interested in finishing high school than in boys, and she had no desire to leave Jerusalem or her family to move to a new country with a stranger over twice her age. But Shula didn't have much choice in the matter. It was 1936, and she came from a traditional Jewish family where parents picked their children's partners. Romance was irrelevant, so was love. So they chose a man who ticked all the boxes. Mr. Joseph Kishak was devout. He came from a good family, and most importantly, he was wealthy. Because Shula's parents were in deep financial trouble. They needed all the help they could get. So it didn't matter how much their daughter cried and pleaded. She would marry this man, 20 years her senior, and move to Beirut to live with him. In time, they believed, she would adjust to married life in a new country, maybe even find some happiness. Lots of girls did. Shulamit Cohen did find happiness, but not the way her parents imagined. She wasn't in love with her husband, but she did fall in love with Beirut. Like Jerusalem, it was small and divided along ethnic and religious lines. Christians in one quarter, Muslims in another. The Jewish quarter, where Shula now lived, was close to the city's commercial center, one of the few places where the city's many ethnic groups met and mingled. Not that Shula was allowed out of the house too often. She had married into a traditional family after all, and they believed that a woman's place was in the home. The only respite from her boredom were her children. While Shula was wrapped up in motherhood, the world was changing by the minute. Borders had been redrawn. Ancient lands had become modern independent nation-states. By the time Shula gave birth to her 5th child, Lebanon had become a sovereign country. She was pregnant with number 6 when the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into 2 states, one for Jews, one for Arabs. Like most of the world's Jews, Shula was deeply invested in the outcome of this vote. Her family lived in Jerusalem, which she still thought of as home. Her sister had joined the Haganah, the underground Jewish militia that protected Jewish communities in Palestine, and she herself led a Zionist youth group in her local synagogue. To the kids in the group, Shula was like a mythical creature, a woman who had actually grown up in the Holy Land. So when the vote passed, Shula was overjoyed. But the rest of Beirut was tense, and armed guards patrolled the Jewish neighborhoods to stave off angry rioters. It worked. The mob destroyed a few Jewish shops in the commercial district, but stayed away from the Jewish quarter. No one was hurt, but the tension was a worrying sign of the trouble ahead. In the wake of the vote, violence consumed the Holy Land, and Lebanese papers began calling for volunteers to fight against the Jews in Palestine. The entire Arab world seemed to be mobilizing. From Morocco to Iraq to Syria to Saudi Arabia, both trained soldiers and volunteers were gearing up for a showdown with the Jewish state that technically wouldn't exist for another few months. Everyone in Lebanon was talking about Palestine, including the 3 men who unknowingly changed Shula's life. In some retellings, these men were high-level Lebanese officials. In others, they were just ordinary Arab customers who had come to shop at her husband's store. Whoever they were, they inspired a legend. As they browsed the selection, they traded news about the upcoming fight for Palestine, never noticing the pregnant Jewish woman in the corner hanging on to their every word. But Shula was paying very close attention, alarm bells ringing in her head as the men talked about the upcoming showdown between Arabs and Jews. Their village had become a makeshift military base for Arab fighters on their way to fight the Jews in Palestine. As volunteers streamed out, arms shipments were streaming in, weapons that would be used against Palestine's Jews, which included Shula's family. Shula had no idea if the men's conversation was true or if they were just talking, trying to one-up each other with invented tales. But she didn't care. If there was even the smallest chance they were telling the truth, she needed to tell someone. Her husband Joseph dismissed her concerns, reminding her that she was pregnant and emotional. It wasn't her place to get involved in these kinds of issues. But Shula refused to let the matter go. She'd spent the past 11 years bored and restless, with few outlets for her quick wit and sharp intelligence. She was not going to let Joseph brush her off so easily, not about something this important. She wrote down everything she remembered: the name of the village, the number of the volunteers, and the news of the weapons shipments. Impulsively, she added her name and her address in case anyone wanted to contact her. And then she waited, and waited, and waited. Her stomach in knots the whole time. 5 weeks later, in the middle of the night, she heard a knock at the door. Outside stood an Arab man who called himself Mossad and told her he had a greeting from her family in Jerusalem. But the letter hidden in the lining of his jacket was not from her family at all. It was from a fledgling intelligence service that would one day be absorbed into the Mossad. Was she ready to accept a mission on behalf of the Jewish community in Palestine? She didn't hesitate to say yes. Her life as a spy had just begun. But that first mission didn't involve spycraft. It involved smuggling. The British planned to leave Palestine by May 15th, after which the Jews would declare independence, fully expecting to be invaded by their neighbors. But for now, the Brits were still in charge, which meant they had final say over who could enter Palestine, as well as the power to deport anyone they pleased. And they had just deported someone important to Palestine's Jewish community, sending him off on a ship bound for Romania. But that ship was expected to make a stop in Beirut, and that's where Shula came in. Her mission was to smuggle him off the boat and stash him somewhere safe until he could sneak back into Palestine. And even though she had no experience with smuggling or covert operations or hiding strange men from the Lebanese authorities, she knew she couldn't say no. That first mission taught Shula 3 very important lessons. The first was that it paid to be friends with criminals. One of her neighbors had connections to Beirut's underworld, including the 2 brothers who controlled Beirut's docks. They agreed to smuggle the man off the ship disguised as a dock worker for the low price of 800 Lebanese pounds. Which brings us to her second lesson. Money talks. Conveniently, Shula's husband Joseph was a rich man, and he handed over the money without a word. The plan worked perfectly. The man was off the ship and in the hiding place Shula had arranged without anyone realizing that he was actually a passenger with the one-way ticket to Europe. Within the week, Shula received word that the mysterious stranger was back home in Palestine, where he belonged. Though she had organized his escape, she never once saw or interacted with him, understanding instinctively that it was safer that way. Her mysterious handlers were so impressed that they asked her to meet them over the border in Palestine. They had more work for her, if she was up for it. And that's how she learned lesson number 3. If you're going to risk everything, you need a support system. Shula's husband had never treated her as an equal. His young wife was a mystery to him, and until now, he never considered that she might have ambitions or interests beyond being a wife and mother. But Joseph had helped with the first mission. It was his suggestion that she get in touch with the underground, and he had handed over cash without a word. She needed him on her side. Despite his worry and misgivings, it didn't take much to get him there. He loved her in his own way, and they had been together long enough that he knew that he couldn't stop her. Plus, he was a deeply religious man who believed that all Jews have an obligation to help one another. He just wished his wife wouldn't endanger herself and their unborn child in order to help. Today, the border between Lebanon and Israel is heavily fortified and patrolled, and it is illegal for Lebanese citizens to have any contact with Israelis. Back in 1948, information and people flowed freely between the farming communities on either side of the border. So it was easy for Shula to sneak into Palestine. It was a lot harder and more dangerous to follow her handler's orders. The first was to keep her ears open for any information, exactly like the details she had already passed on. Almost casually, her handlers warned her that if Lebanon went to war with the new Jewish state, she would become a traitor to her country. If caught, she would likely pay for her treason with her life. They reminded her that she could still get out of the situation if she wanted. She could go back to Beirut, give birth to baby number 6, and resume her comfortable, boring life. But Shula had no intention of going back to her life as a homemaker. She loved her children, but she craved more. And now, here it was. A different life, a purpose outside of her family. The thought of refusing the mission never crossed her mind. So her handlers gave her a second assignment. The Jewish agency was preparing for a massive influx of Jewish refugees from across the Arab world. Would Shula help smuggle them through Lebanon if needed? Again, Shula agreed. Passing on information was one thing. She didn't know where it went or what her handlers did with it, or if it made any difference at all. Smuggling refugees, on the other hand, was a concrete and immediate way to save lives, including possibly her own. Because in the grand scheme of things, a little human trafficking was a much less serious charge than treason. If she did get caught, she could avoid the hangman's noose by pretending that she was merely helping refugees, not spying for an enemy country. But she wasn't really worried about getting caught. Who would ever suspect a pregnant housewife? The moment she returned to Beirut, she started building up her network. She began in the underworld, with dock workers and black marketeers and peddlers who could be bribed to pass on useful information. She paid well, and no one ever asked why a pregnant Jewish mother of 5 had so many questions about the goings-on in their villages. But when Jewish refugees from Syria and Iraq began flooding Beirut's Jewish quarter, Shula realized she couldn't rely exclusively on the underground anymore. If she wanted to move hundreds of refugees out of the tiny, cramped Jewish quarter and into the new state of Israel, and away from the prying eyes of police, she would need friends in high places, people with the power to make inconvenient questions disappear. And then, the Jewish state declared independence. 5 Arab armies, including Lebanon's, invaded the Jewish state. Shula's adopted country was now at war with the place she considered home, and the stakes got much, much higher. Beirut was flooded with Jewish and Arab refugees. After Israel declared independence, Arab countries began expelling their Jews. Only the armed guards stationed in the Jewish quarter managed to stave off the angry mobs of Palestinians looking for revenge. The president of Lebanon grew increasingly worried about his citizens' safety. As a Christian, he eyed this flood of mostly Muslim refugees with alarm. His multi-ethnic country was walking a tightrope. Hundreds of thousands of angry refugees could upset the delicate balance Lebanon had established. So President El-Khoury established an undercover all-Christian intelligence unit to infiltrate the refugee camps that had sprung up all over Lebanon. But the officer in charge, George Anton, wasn't just watching the Palestinians. He was watching Shula, too. He knew that there were thousands of Jewish refugees from Syria hiding in Beirut. He knew that someone was moving them across the border into Israel. And when his men caught one of her smugglers with a letter in Hebrew addressed to Shula, he called her into his office. Terrified but defiant, she denied everything. Nothing he said or did could break her resolves. Not the twice-weekly interrogations in his office, not the men he sent to question her children at school, not even the prospect of a trial before a military court. Inside, she was trembling in fear. Behind the scenes, she made arrangements to send her oldest children to Israel. Whatever happened to her, she needed to make sure her children would survive. But on the outside, she was unflappable. Nothing could shatter her calm. Until George Anton dropped his bombshell and upended her world once more. Anton didn't believe any of Shula's denials. He knew she was working for Israel, even if he couldn't prove it. And he wanted to help her. Like Shula, George was a minority, a Christian in a region dominated by Muslims. And that meant he was deeply invested in the prospect of a country built and governed by a minority group. The survival of the Jewish state was proof that the minorities in the Middle East could tilt the balance of power in their favor, upending the Muslim dominance of the past 1,200 years. This explanation made sense, sort of. It was one thing to sympathize with the national liberation of a minority group. It was another to become a double agent, a member of the Lebanese intelligence services, passing information to an enemy state. Shula was convinced George was laying a trap. If he wanted to help her, why was he following her every move? Why would he send men to interrogate her children at school? Why would he threaten her with a military trial? But Anton insisted he had to make it look like he was doing his job. The more thorough his investigation, the less suspicious it would look when Shula was finally cleared. And he did clear her. He convinced the military courts to call off her trial. After all, she was just a housewife who had never even graduated high school. She wasn't capable of organizing a smuggling ring. Of course, from their very first meeting, Anton understood who Shula was. He knew she was capable, cunning, and shrewd. He knew she was lying to him about working for the Israelis. And he knew that if he wanted to gain her trust, he'd have to prove himself. He took her to the top secret site where the Lebanese army was planning to build its central ammunition arsenals. And he told her that he was ready to meet her with her handlers. Anton wasn't the only high-level operative she snagged. Through a combination of charm, intelligence, luck, and sheer chutzpah, Shula managed to work her way into the upper echelons of Lebanese society. It certainly helped that she was married to a wealthy man, but she had made these connections all by herself. By the early 50s, she was rubbing shoulders with politicians and Gulf princes, even the Lebanese president. Any information she learned went straight to her handlers. But it was dangerous to send letters by hand over the border. Instead, Shula and her handlers passed information back and forth through a local pharmacy. They used the labels on medicine bottles to conceal messages written in invisible ink. There were times Shula found herself in the pharmacy almost every day. Even the birth of her 7th child didn't slow her down. But information flowed in 2 directions. The more prominent Shula became, the larger her network grew, the harder it was to maintain secrecy. Everyone in the Jewish quarter knew she was smuggling refugees. Criminal kingpins knew her name. Syrian and Egyptian intelligence had an ever-growing file on her. The Egyptians tried to assassinate her. The Syrians tried to kidnap her. The Lebanese threw her in jail. But none of the charges stuck. Shula was well-connected, she was wealthy, she was quick-witted and brave. But her luck ran out in 1961. By this point, many of her contacts had read the writing on the wall. George Anton had resigned and left the country. Lebanon was in turmoil, and if he was caught passing information to the Israelis, he would suffer terribly before he was executed. His resignation came just in time. One by one, Lebanese intelligence scooped up Shula's contacts. They came for her in the middle of the night. Her children and husband watched in stunned silence as they manhandled her into a police car. At first, the police were relatively polite. But as the weeks went on and Shula refused to admit to anything other than smuggling refugees, their tactics changed. Polite questions gave way to insults. Insults gave way to abuse. But after 3 months of beatings that dislocated her jaw and knocked out 4 teeth, Shula still hadn't talked, and she maintained her innocence through her trial, admitting only that she had smuggled Jews. Outwardly, she never lost her composure, not when the papers called her a matahari, insinuating she had traded sex for state secrets. Not when the prosecutor accused her of rocking the cradle with one hand and turning the world upside down with the other. Not when the judge read out her sentence. Hanging. Not even when she learned that her husband had also been imprisoned. But Joseph knew nothing about his wife's spying. He was guilty only of being married to a spy and of helping her smuggle Jews. Eventually, he was let out of prison, emaciated and confused, to try and salvage what was left of his life. Once free, he learned his wife would not be hanged after all. Her lawyer had managed to get the sentence commuted. 20 years hard labor in a Lebanese prison. If she survived, she would be released in her mid-60s. By then, she would surely have many grandchildren, but she would be nothing more than a legend to them. The grandma who spied for Israel and was sent to prison. But Shula did not serve her 20 years of hard labor, because in 1967, Israel won the Six-Day War, capturing vast swaths of territory from its neighbors, including East Jerusalem. Lebanon had not been involved in the war, but the Lebanese consul and his staff had been stationed in Jerusalem, and if Lebanon wanted them back, they need to release all of their Jewish prisoners, including Shulamit Cohen. By this point, Shula had spent 6 years in hell. The woman who had emerged from the Lebanese prison had been electrocuted and beaten so severely, she lost sight in one eye. Her fingernails had been ripped out, her body had been broken, and yet somehow, she was the same Shula, tall, proud, and defiant. Later, she would credit her faith, saying she owed her survival to God, that she prayed daily in her cell, even as her fellow prisoners mocked and harassed her. Improbably, miraculously, her prayers for redemption came true. She spent the rest of her life in her beloved Jerusalem, surrounded by dozens of grandchildren, who called her Grandma James Bond. She passed away at the age of 100. She hadn't just lived through history, she had helped write it. She had defied societal expectations of what a woman should be. The world had underestimated her, and she had proven them wrong. Most people have heard of Eli Cohen, the famous Israeli spy who was caught in Damascus. Far fewer have heard about the other Cohen who spied for Israel. But she deserves to have her story told. She deserves to have her name remembered.